In 2018, more than 10,000 people signed a petition to reopen a British theme park. By then, the park had been closed for over a decade. The rides had already been auctioned. The buildings had already been demolished. All that remained was 114 acres of cleared ground and a 30-acre lake sitting in the middle of it, holding the shape of a place that no longer existed. A roller coaster from this park is still running today. Not in England. The site had failed before. In 1985, a park called Britannia Park opened on the same ground near Ilkeston, on the edge of Nottingham and Derby. It lasted 10 weeks. The founder, Peter Kellard, was later imprisoned for fraud. The land itself had been subject to deep seam and open-cast coal mining for generations, and some of the remediation work done by the original developers was later described as shoddy. The ground was unstable before anyone ever sold a ticket. The county council purchased the site in 1986 and leased it to Granada, the British media conglomerate, which through its subsidiary Park Hall Leisure invested approximately £8 million to transform the wreckage of Britannia Park into something genuinely ambitious. In June 1987, the American adventure opened. It was marketed as Britain's major new theme park, a Wild West dream built on coal-mined English countryside. And in its first season, roughly 400,000 visitors walked through the gates. Theming was the thing that made it different. This was not a collection of fairground rides bolted to a field. Granada built Silver City, a full-scale Wild West frontier town with wooden boardwalks, painted storefronts, and the kind of environmental detail that regional British parks rarely attempted. The saloon was called Lazy Lil's, and it staged live gunfight shows for the crowds multiple times a day, with performers drawing pistols in the street and stuntmen falling from balconies. Children who grew up visiting the park in the late 1980s remember Silver City the way they remember a place they should not have been able to reach. Something cinematic and slightly unreal, sitting in the middle of the East Midlands. The initial ride lineup leaned entirely into the concept. The Cherokee Falls log flume, with its 2 drops through a frontier canyon. The runaway mine train threading through rock work tunnels. The Buffalo Stampede roller coaster charging across the open landscape. Families drove from across Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, and Sheffield, sometimes 2 hours in each direction, because there was nothing else in the region that felt quite like this. For children growing up in the late 1980s, the American adventure was their park, the one close enough to visit on a school trip, the one where the Wild West felt strangely real in the middle of England. The scale of the ambition matters here. £8 million in 1987 is equivalent to roughly £25 million today, and Granada spent most of it on atmosphere rather than ride count. The park covered 114 acres, with the 30-acre lake at its center serving as both a visual anchor and a practical barrier that forced guests to move through the themed zones rather than cut across them. The footprint alone was enormous for a regional park. It was bigger than most visitors realized while they were inside it. The dust kicks up on the main street. The saloon doors swing open. A gunshot cracks. Children are screaming and laughing and pressing against the rope barrier, and somewhere behind them, the mine train is rattling through its tunnel, and the log flume is sending up a curtain of water that catches the light. That was the peak. But the ground the park stood on had already started to move. In 1989, the park expanded. The original Wild West theme broadened to include wider elements of North American culture and history, and the centerpiece of that expansion was the Missile, a Vekoma Boomerang roller coaster that had originally operated at the Glasgow Garden Festival in 1988 under the name the Coca-Cola Roller. Relocated to the American Adventure site, the Missile delivered a layout that sent riders forward through a loop and 2 corkscrews, then reversed the entire sequence backwards. The ride was voted the #1 roller coaster in the UK. For a regional park competing against Alton Towers, Thorpe Park, and Gulliver's, all within roughly an hour's drive, that was an extraordinary distinction. At peak season, the Missile queue stretched well past the 1-hour mark, snaking back through Silver City past the saloon and out toward the main street. And people waited anyway. The park that had drawn 400,000 visitors in its first season was now drawing crowds that the original infrastructure had not been designed to absorb. In 1990, the park added Gold Rush, a standalone rapids ride that used the lake's water system, and the Nightmare, a Huss troika that became a reliable evening draw. Attendance in the early 1990s regularly exceeded 450,000 visitors per season, and in its strongest years, the park reportedly approached 500,000. For a site that had started as fraudulent rubble, those numbers represented something that should not have been possible. The park had genuinely worked. In 1993, the Cherokee Falls log flume was extended with a 3rd drop and renamed Nightmare Niagara, featuring a 63-foot plunge that became one of the most recognizable ride moments in the Midlands. The splash at the base of that drop was visible from Silver City's main street, a white curtain of water rising above the rooflines and catching the afternoon light before it fell back into the channel. Children who had been brought to the park by their parents were now old enough to queue on their own, and they were queuing for Nightmare Niagara. The park was growing. The problem was what it was growing on top of. There was a structural irony built into the American Adventure from its first day. The size that made the park feel unlike anything else in the Midlands, the 114 acres, the 30-acre lake, the room to build Silver City as a full townscape rather than a single facade, all of it was made possible by the fact that the land had been so thoroughly excavated and remediated that nobody else wanted it. Coal mining had carved out the geography. The county council had acquired the land cheaply because of its history, and Granada had leased it at terms that reflected the site's industrial past. The American Adventure existed at the scale. It did because the ground had already been consumed once, and now that ground wanted something back. The American Adventure was built on land that had been mined for coal across multiple eras. The subsidence that had plagued the site before Britannia Park ever opened had never been fully resolved. And now, it came for the park's front door. The original main entrance to the American Adventure had to be permanently closed due to ground subsidence. The replacement entrance, by most accounts, was far less attractive, less welcoming, less of a statement. A park that needed to announce itself as a destination worth the drive was now greeting visitors through what felt like a side door. Some accounts suggest the move was also partly motivated by a desire to create a single-level layout for the park, but the subsidence was real and documented. The earth beneath a theme park was slowly rejecting what had been built on top of it. The entrance failure was visible and discussed. What almost never gets mentioned is how the theming itself began to fracture from the inside. When the park first opened in 1987, every ride connected to the Wild West narrative. The log flume moved through a frontier canyon. The mine train ran through tunnel rockwork. The Buffalo Stampede was named for the landscape it charged across. The identity was coherent. You were somewhere specific. By 1995, that coherence was breaking. The Iron Wolf roller coaster, installed that year, was not themed around the American frontier at all. It was themed around the ITV game show Gladiators, a British television tie-in standing in the middle of a Wild West park. The ride was popular, but its presence announced something the owners may not have intended, that Silver City was now a backdrop rather than a destination, a coat of paint over a commercial decision rather than a world someone had chosen to build. The attention to detail that had made the American adventure feel like a place rather than a collection of rides was quietly dissolving. And the owners did not seem to notice or did not have the money to care. And it was not just the theming. The park sat within an hour of Alton Towers, which had the budget and the brand recognition that the American adventure could never match. Alton Towers was spending tens of millions of pounds per major attraction through the 1990s. The American adventure was spending fractions of that, and the gap showed in the ride announcements, the maintenance cycles, and the marketing. The American adventure never advertised itself effectively, particularly through the mid-1990s. Its audience rarely grew beyond the East Midlands. The people who loved it fiercely, but the people who had never heard of it stayed that way. Then came January 1997. Granada sold the American adventure to a new company called Venture World for £3.5 million, roughly half of what Granada had originally invested in the park's first season alone. The sale was part of Granada's broader divestment of leisure assets, and it marked the beginning of the end. John Broome, known in the industry for his earlier involvement with Alton Towers, came on as a consultant. The park was briefly rebranded as American Adventure World, an apparent attempt to move away from the theming that had defined its identity for a decade. Under Broome's involvement, the only noticeable changes were the addition of minor and upcharge attractions, and the slow, visible decline of the park's existing rides. In 1999, Broome departed. The leisure group owned by Trevor Hemmings, which also controlled Pontins and Blackpool Tower, took over ownership. But the lake was still sitting in the middle of all of it, unchanged, holding the shape of a dream that the operators kept changing around it. Company accounts later revealed that the American adventure posted losses every single year under Venture World's ownership. The accounts showed losses of £1.1 million in 2002, £1.2 million in 2003, £2 million in 2004, and $1.6 million in the final season. The numbers were not stabilizing. They were bleeding. In April 2003, Venture World attempted to gain planning permission for a £15 million holiday village next to the park, which the owners described as the only way to save the park from possible closure. The planning documents described chalets and leisure facilities stretching across land that still had the mine train's track running through it. The outcome of that application was never definitively confirmed. What was confirmed was that no holiday village was ever built. By 2005, the park had been stripped of the things that had made people drive there in the first place. Nightmare Niagara, the 63-foot log flume, was closed. The water rides were reportedly shut down due to structural instability and water pollution problems. The Missile, which had been voted the best roller coaster in the country 16 years earlier, was closed as well, reportedly due to heavy disrepair and a decision that it no longer fit the park's new focus on younger families. The rides that had defined the American adventure for nearly 2 decades were left standing but not operating. The park continued to sell tickets around them, but the silhouettes of the rides that no longer ran were visible from the queue lines of the rides that still did. That should have been the end. It nearly was. On the 4th of January 2007, after 19 years of operation, the American Adventure announced that it would not reopen for the 2007 season. The announcement was brief. There was no farewell event, no final weekend, no public ceremony for a park that had drawn hundreds of thousands of visitors across 2 decades. The gates simply did not open again. What followed was an auction. Over 1,300 lots were offered. Rides, costumes, signage, infrastructure, everything the park had ever been reduced to numbered items in a catalog. The missile left the site. It reopened on the 28th of June, 2007 at Pleasurewood Hills in Suffolk, under the name Wipeout. It remains, since its relocation, one of the few boomerang coasters ever built in the UK, and the only one still operating in the country. The Mini Mine Rush children's coaster was relocated to Flamingo Land. The Iron Wolf, the gladiators-themed coaster that had broken the park's own identity, ended up in a Polish theme park under the name Tic Tac Tornado. By April 2008, a visitor returning to the site described it simply. The place is definitely looking deserted, and there is not a lot left. The American Adventure sign on the drive into the park had been removed. The rides were dismantled. The buildings were cleared. Silver City was gone. Lazy Lil's was gone. The entrance that had subsided was gone. The replacement entrance was gone. The lake was still there. 30 acres of water sitting in the middle of cleared ground, looking exactly the way it had looked before Britannia Park, before Granada, before the missile, before the shootouts in Silver City, before any of it. Everything that could be auctioned had been sold. Everything that could be demolished had been flattened. The lake could not be moved. But this story has one more chapter. The site lay derelict from 2007, and the petitions began. In 2017, thousands signed a petition to reopen the park. In 2018, a second petition gathered more than 10,000 signatures. People who had grown up visiting the American Adventure as children, who remembered the mine train and the log flume and the saloon on the main street, were asking for it back. By the time they asked, the answer was already visible from the road. The site was being redeveloped for housing. The county council, which had been the landowner throughout the park's entire history, from the fraudulent 10 weeks of Britannia Park through every season of the American Adventure, was overseeing the transformation of 114 acres of theme park land into a residential estate. The rides are scattered across 3 countries now. The missile runs in Suffolk under a name nobody near Ilkeston would recognize. The Iron Wolf runs in Poland under a name nobody in England would recognize. The children's coaster runs at Flamingo Land, the park that was built on coal-mined ground, that lost its entrance to subsidence, that lost its identity to a dozen different owners and a gladiator's roller coaster, that bled money every year of its final chapter, is becoming a place where people will live without knowing what was underneath their feet. The lake that was there before any of it, that survived every operator, Every rebrand, every auction lot is still full. It does not know the difference. Did you visit the American Adventure before it closed? Leave the year in the comments. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe.